In addition to establishing peer support groups, one of our aims is to inform and equip individuals and communities to make a positive response to mental health issues. So we're really delighted to have our two speakers. Firstly, Dr. Lucy Johnstone, and she's a UK clinical psychologist who's worked in adult mental health settings for many years and has alternated between academic posts and is currently a trainer and writer. She's authored a number of articles, chapters and books, and we are delighted that this isn't an official launch, but that today, the second edition of A Straight Talking Introduction to Psychiatric Diagnosis is published by PCCS. So I'm going to hand over now to Lucy, who's going to present to us. And we'll be taking questions right at the end of the session, so not during it. But if anything occurs to you now, put it in the chat and we'll make a note of it later. Thank you. Over to you, Lucy.
Hello, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be here today. And I think John is going to show the slides that I'm about to speak to. That's it. Okay, great, fantastic. So Jackie and I have both got a relatively short time to introduce you to some ideas which may be familiar to you, may not, or some of them may be familiar to you. And I'm going to kick off by summarising some of the problems with our current way of thinking. So if you can put up the next slide, John. These can be controversial discussions, of course, so it's important to be very clear that, no, that's right, that slide, that absolutely nobody is challenging or disagreeing with the idea that people who receive psychiatric services are in states of distress and are really struggling. And people can struggle, of course, in all sorts of ways. Nobody's questioning or challenging that at all. But the question that I think is worth raising is, how do we best understand those struggles? Are people suffering from medical illnesses which need diagnosing? Now, some people find that a helpful way of thinking, so that's fine. But a number of people, quite a lot of people, are not told that there are a number of different ways of understanding distress. And for some people, those different ways actually make more sense and are more helpful. So I'm going to briefly look at some of the problems with the medical approach, which is, of course, the dominant one. Next slide. So people, of course, have a range of reactions to receiving a psychiatric diagnosis. Here's some examples. Some people say, well, it feels like I've got an explanation, feels like I can start to understand what's happening. Some people find it helpful at first and then feel they want to move on from it. But some people actually find a label humiliating and upsetting and stigmatizing and damaging. So it is important, I think, that while we recognize the range of responses, we also offer people forms of explanation that makes most sense to them and are most helpful to them. Next slide, please. So I'm going to do a very, very brief summary of some of the criticisms of diagnosis. You'll be familiar, I expect, with the idea all the diagnoses that are used in psychiatric services, counselling, and in many other places, including our welfare system, are listed in a giant manual called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And it's currently in its 5th edition, which came out in 2013. What you may be less aware of is that the very people who drew up these diagnostic manuals, very senior psychiatrists and other people, have publicly said these are not fit for purpose. And just to answer a question that's appeared in the chat, you're very welcome to have a copy of the slides. There is no reason to believe that DSM-5 is safe or scientifically sound. That's quite a damning statement. DSM is an absolute scientific nightmare. The weakness is its lack of validity. Dr. Alan Francis, who's actually chair of the DSM-4 committee, says there is no definition of mental disorder and you just can't define it. It's bullshit. Now, those are strong statements, and very few people are told at the same time as they're being given a diagnosis that even the people who draw up these categories have expressed very serious doubts about them. And in fact, there is a number of projects underway to completely replace our current system of diagnosis. Next slide, please. So we're kind of in a limbo state. In effect, we are saying, although not always saying it very publicly, and certainly not saying it directly to service users themselves very often, we are saying this way of understanding doesn't actually make sense, isn't scientifically based. We need a better one, but we don't know what that is. So we're in a kind of limbo state. That seems to me that it's even more important that people are offered information about the limitations of the diagnostic approach and are also offered information about alternatives. Next slide, please. So to give a very brief illustration, you will be familiar, I'm sure, with this particular diagnosis, often experienced as one of the more stigmatizing ones, borderline personality disorder. How do you diagnose borderline personality disorder? Well, the idea is that you are said by someone who's doing the diagnosing to fit this list of descriptions, or at least most of them. You perhaps are said to have unstable and intense interpersonal relationships. Your mood goes very up and down. You may be making suicide attempts and so on. You may be experiencing a lot of anger. So while these may be real problems, this does raise the questions of whether these can really be understood as symptoms in the same way that we understand symptoms of things that go wrong in our bodies, whatever those are. These are actually not about things going wrong in our bodies. These are about sometimes unusual, sometimes distressing, but ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving. Next slide, please. Now, if you fill in some of the background, then, as you may well know, a very large proportion of people, mainly women who are given this diagnosis, have experienced childhood trauma and/or adult trauma. So it is at least arguable that a lot of these ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving, for example, feeling angry, feeling distrustful, feeling very unsafe in the world, are understandable responses to what people have been through, or indeed some level useful responses. If the world seems a dangerous place, if you've been badly treated, it may make absolute sense to be quite distrustful, to be angry, and to want to fight back. So you could make a similar criticism of all the other diagnoses in DSM, but essentially it boils down to maybe these are understandable responses to difficult life circumstances. Next slide, please. So what are we doing when we decide that somebody is mentally ill, so-called? Well, it's very difficult because, as I think you can see, all of these experiences are on a continuum. All of us feel angry at times. All of us feel unsafe or distrustful at times. We cannot draw a scientific line between what is supposedly normal and abnormal. And a lot of the stuff you may have heard about chemical imbalances or genes of so-called mental illness has simply not been proven. This is what senior psychiatrist David Kupfer is saying in this quote: we're still waiting for biomarkers, for actually solid evidence for a lot of the things that we're told as fact, like chemical imbalances, like genetic causes of various forms of mental distress. Next slide, please. So psychiatric diagnoses, from the point of view of critics, are not what they claim to be. It sounds as though we're making the same kind of medical scientific judgment as we are in diagnosing, let's say, cancer or tuberculosis or COVID, but actually we're doing something rather different. We are making social judgments which are ultimately based on social expectations and standards about things that we feel are unacceptable ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving. As I've said, of course, people may genuinely be very distressed, but is this best understood as a medical problem? And if we start saying, well, actually, perhaps these are not best understood as medical problems, of course, an awful lot of other things come under question. Next slide, please. So we're offered diagnosis as kind of an explanation, but I would argue it's not actually an explanation. So if somebody comes along and asks, why did this person have delusions? The answer is because they have schizophrenia. And if you then ask, how do you know they have schizophrenia? The answer is because they have delusions. Every diagnosis works like this. Why does this person have mood swings? Because they have bipolar disorder. How do you know they have bipolar disorder? Because they have mood swings. Now, of course, they may well have unusual beliefs or mood swings or whatever, but this type of because of this it's caused by this diagnosis actually isn't much of an explanation. Whereas in other branches of medicine, we have a way out, we have tests. Now, of course, no one has ever produced a test that can show whether or not, for example, your serotonin levels are lower in what we call depression. So it's a kind of circular argument, but it's one that has consequences, and those consequences aren't always helpful. Next slide, please. And just to show that I'm not the only one saying this kind of thing, here's a recent report from the United Nations saying that diagnostic tools like the DSM are not based on a solid scientific basis. We have been sold a myth that the best solutions are medications. That doesn't mean they have no uses, but it may mean we're overselling these solutions. The UN report recommends, among other things, we should be looking much more at social determinants, things that go on in people's lives, things that we know about, poverty and deprivation and discrimination and so on. And we should be looking much more at the power imbalance, the lack of power and the lack of resources and the lack of opportunities that people may have in their lives, not the chemical imbalance. Next slide, please. So what do we do instead of diagnosis? Well, diagnosis will continue to be necessary for some purposes. So I don't think anyone's suggesting we just tear it away and we refuse to give people these labels. They may need them for some purposes. But how do we really get a better understanding of what's going on in people's lives? And in very broad terms, the answer, I think, is to listen to people's stories. Everybody comes into services with a story of some sort. So this is a quote from an excellent book, Searching for a Rose Garden, nearly all the chapters are written by service users. Until we're able to use our own words to tell our own stories, the context we find ourselves in says our stories for us and usually gets it wrong. We learn to say that we are ill. We begin to see ourselves as ill. We tell stories of illness. And the psychiatric system, by extension, society, accepts illness as the story of our distress. Being able to tell your own story sets not the illness story, sets a new social context. In part, healing happens in the restoring of our lives. I think that's a very profound and important statement. And of course, peer groups are one of the many places in which people can share their stories, talk about their lives in a very different way. And if they want to, and if it makes sense to them, come up with a different understanding of their struggles. Next slide, please. So Jackie's going to talk about some of the alternative ways of constructing a non-medical story, if you want to, and there are lots of them. Some of them involve professional support, therapies, counselling, and so on. Some of them don't necessarily, writing, keeping journals, peer support. And historically and cross-culturally, there have always been ways of understanding our stories. And this is still the case in many cultures and many countries. Actually, we're all as human beings pretty good at making meaning and telling stories if someone else doesn't stop us by imposing a particular story on us, which is what can too often happen in psychiatric services. So really, we need to think more about giving people opportunities to explore and create their own stories. Next slide, please. Instead of asking what's wrong with you, we need to ask what's happened to you. It's a common slogan. Jackie has popularized this slogan. It also describes a lot of the assumptions behind trauma-informed perspectives, which we're going to hear about in a minute. If you asked me what the simple alternative is for those who want it, instead of diagnosing people, we need to listen to their stories. Next slide. Now, because I think it's very important that people are given information about the pros and cons of diagnosis and information about the alternatives, I wrote this book. As Meg said, the second edition came out today. The link will be in the chat, A Straight Talking Introduction to Psychiatric Diagnosis. It talks you through the arguments, the ones I've only just touched on just now. It is, I hope, accessible and readable, because I very strongly believe that whatever people ultimately decide, they do have the right to be fully informed. They do have the right to really understand what their choices are. Next slide. So the messages of the book are to summarise the arguments, pros and cons, describe some of the alternatives, introduce people to some of the alternatives. Now, of course, most people are not going to be in a position to give up their diagnoses entirely. You may need them for access to benefits and services and so on, but actually you do not have to think of yourself or define your problems in that way if that's not the way that you find most helpful. And if you do find it helpful, this should be really a matter of your choice, not simply because a professional has told you this is the only way to understand your difficulties and this is what you have to believe. Final slide. I'm also going to flag up this book, which is one of a number of ways of putting together a story that is non-diagnostic. So the Power Threat Meaning Framework, which is a very ambitious project that came out about 5 years ago, it was put together by psychologists and survivors, gives us one way of putting together narrative, putting together a story that is not based on diagnosis. I'm pleased to say it's been taken up by some peer groups, and at least some people have found it a very helpful alternative ways of understanding the difficulties they're facing in their lives. Thank you. That's it from me.